Today, we have a very special episode of the Virtual Jewel Box, podcast of the Tanner Humanities Center, that delves into our own history. We are recording this in March 2025, at a time when there is widespread debate and public doubt about the importance of education, the role of the university, and the value and even the very point of the humanities. I'm Scott Black, director of the Tanner Humanities Center, and it's my job to advocate, explain, and demonstrate the worth of what we do in the humanities. I'm privileged to do so at the generously endowed Obert C and Grace A Tanner Humanities Center. Today I am joined by Mark Matheson to talk about Obert Tanner, his family, his legacy, and his vision for the centrality of education and the humanities for everyone. Dr. Mark Matheson is professor, lecturer in English at the University of Utah. He earned his DPhil at Oxford and has taught at the U for the past 34 years. His courses on Shakespeare are legendary and have been among the most popular, indeed beloved classes in the English department for generations of students. When I meet people across the state and tell them that I work in the English department at the U, more often than not, they light up and tell me how much they enjoyed Professor Matheson's classes and how meaningful they were to their development, both personally and professionally. Mark regularly teaches in the Honors College, and he is director of the Tanner Lecture on Human Values. Today, however, Mark is not joining us as a scholar and professor of Shakespeare, but as a lifelong Utah resident and one of our best local historians, to talk about Obert and Grace Tanner and their family. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's really an honor to be with you, my longtime colleague and chair in your earlier work in the English department. I so appreciate what you're doing for the Tanner Humanities Center, which was very central to Obert and Grace and to their daughter, Carolyn Tanner Irish, whose name graces the building we're in. And I also want to thank my longtime colleague and friend with the Tanner Lectures on Human Values, Beth James, who's here helping us with technical matters that are certainly beyond my scope.
So Obert Tanner tells his own story in his autobiography, A Man's Search for Freedom, and he tells his mother's equally remarkable story in the classic A Mormon Mother, his edition of her autobiography. I'd like to start with a passage from Obert's introduction to his mother's autobiography. There was her deep satisfaction in learning, her joy with books and lectures, and her search for knowledge about the world, the causes of events, the motives of people, and scientific explanations. With religious devotion, she loved and sought the truth with all her mind and all her soul. And in this quest for truth, her children came to believe with her that a university was the noblest creation of man. That's a wonderful passage.
I couldn't agree more, Scott. I think it's also a very central passage toward an understanding of both Annie Clark Tanner and her 10th and last child, Obert Clark Tanner. I just want to say at the beginning that in that same foreword to the 1973 publication of Annie Clark Tanner's autobiography, A Mormon Mother, Obert also says, I think very movingly, this is 32 years after his mother's death, that he writes this, that his mother is in fact a great mystery to him. And I certainly share the son's sense about Annie Clark Tanner. I think she's one of the most remarkable people about whom I've ever read. But I just wanted to say at the beginning of our conversation, which I'm so happy to be engaged in, that Obert is a mystery to me in many profound ways. And so I'm very honored to be talking about his life in all of its extraordinary dimensions today. But I want to strike the humble Tanner note by suggesting that understanding Obert and his life from my own perspective, and there are certain limits to that.
I definitely appreciate that, and I think that's probably true of anyone else, but especially someone as complicated and interesting as him. Could you give us just some basic background? You had mentioned that he is the 10th and I believe youngest child of his mother, who has had a very complicated life as a second plural wife at the end of the 19th century in a polygamous marriage, which she interestingly believed in, or at least she writes about it in complicated ways. She herself was struggling with this. She leaned heavily on her own faith to come to terms with it. And that's one very interesting aspect of her very difficult life. She raised a lot of children in very difficult circumstances, and they were remarkably successful. Give us a little bit of a background on this.
I think that your observation about Annie Clark's life as a very important and indispensable point for a beginning point for a discussion about Obert's life is very important. Annie was a very bright woman, and Obert was always grateful for that, grateful for their conversations about books and ideas and lectures all his life. And in the early 1880s, she went to Brigham Young Academy, became Brigham Young University later. And Karl Maeser was a German Mormon immigrant who was an educator in Germany and who ran the Brigham Young Academy at the time she was there from about 1881 to 1883. And he made the comment that she was the most outstanding student in her class. And even in his 1973 introduction to A Mormon Mother, Annie's Story, Obert mentions that. He was very proud of his mother's intellectual gifts and achievements. And she did enter into a polygamous marriage with Joseph Marion Tanner. And he was a very prominent person in early Mormonism as well, and really had a career within the church and within Utah institutions of higher learning as a very notable educator. And Annie Clark was his second wife. He went on to marry 3 more wives, and including a wife whom he married about 6 months after he married Annie Clark Tanner. And it needs to be said that Joseph Marion Tanner, as Obert writes, was a great success in life, but by no means a great success in his role in Obert's family. Joseph Marion Tanner did not provide economically for the family, or did so only very sporadically. And this meant that Annie Clark had to do menial work to support her family. Obert mentions in his autobiography that she scrubbed other people's floors for 15 cents an hour. In those years, Obert was born in 1904, as we mentioned, the 10th and last of Annie Clark's children. And the bond between the youngest child and his mother was, I think, rich and profound from the very beginning. And I think that the mystery of Annie Clark's life, as Obert calls it, and is, I think, as I've said elsewhere, is in many ways the perpetual surprise of Obert Tanner's story, that, growing up in very conservative institutions in late 19th century Utah, Annie Clark emerged in her life as a remarkably independent thinker, someone who cherished the freedom of her children and supported it. She ran her home on the basis of John Stuart Mill's great classic of Anglo-American liberalism, On Liberty. She talks about that herself, and Obert talks about it. And her home was impoverished, but not a home in which, as Obert said, the humiliations of poverty were felt because of the remarkable strengths of his mother. And she clearly inspired him from his own early childhood with a vision of the importance of education, and specifically the importance of the humanities in human experience and in the work of holding societies together and making them better and more just.
And he does describe, either he or she, I can't remember, describe their house as full of books. Mm-hmm. And clearly she inspired in him, as you said, a love, a curiosity, a love of education, a sense that they should be thinking for themselves. Mm-hmm. And trying to make up their own minds, even about received conventional wisdom.
Yeah, no, I think he said later in his life that as his mother grew, and through great trials, both practical and emotional and spiritual, as she grew, she became remarkably independent of the authorities, as he said, institutional and domestic, that had been in place during her growing up years and that had in many ways dictated the terms of her marriage. And I think one of the things that Obert finds very mysterious about Annie's life, his mother's life, is that somehow she was able to achieve this kind of emancipation of her own spiritual and intellectual life. And I do think it's very much the case that Obert saw her early experience in higher learning, which she regarded herself as transformative, as really a very empowering, sustaining moment in her life, which she really maintained through conversations well into the 20th century with her dear son, Obert, about learning and about teaching. And Obert, as we know, is famous for two things, being an educator and being an extraordinary businessman. And he would say very frankly that, in fact, it was always far more important to his mother that he succeed as an educator and as a teacher and as a thinker than as a businessman. She appreciated his success in that regard, but learning and teaching in the humanities always came first. And Obert said, and I imbibed that, and it was always first for me too.
Nevertheless, I do want to talk about his business career, which was quite remarkable. He was coming from a very poor, materially poor background, but
That's right.
actually spiritually rich, it sounds like, and he was encouraged and supported as a child. But he was starting from nothing, and yet he became an extraordinarily successful businessman. Could you give us the outlines of his career?
When he was still a young man, he started as an itinerant salesman of recognition pins that he did not yet have a company to produce for high school graduates and graduates from LDS seminary courses. And he learned a lot in that process. He, I think, discovered, though he wasn't always successful, and he's the first one to say that he really did have gifts as a salesman. And those early successes led him to establish the O.C. Tanner Company in 1927 in his mother's home, which was down on the corner of Fenway Avenue and 12th East, a couple of stones throws away from where we are now. And he started working on manufacturing jewelry on a bench in that home, then his mother's home, who was by then in Salt Lake. And things took off. And it wasn't always a kind of steady rise, but he devoted himself to this. And I think he had a couple of really active and profound motives for becoming the business success that, in fact, he became. And one is, I think he wanted to help his mother. Mm-hmm. And he knew that she had lived in really a kind of miserable state from the standpoint of her material surroundings. And I think he was deeply motivated to become successful in business so that he could provide her with the material support that she hadn't had since her marriage. And he successfully did that. And interestingly, Obert continued to, and I think this is also coming right out of his relationship with his mother, to support single women, often single older women, throughout his life. And they would find one day that their mortgage had been paid off. And it turned out that Obert had paid off their mortgage and things like that. And Obert did that, as Carolyn said, for the other wives of Joseph, Mary, and Tanner who survived him. He paid off their mortgages. There was this great sense of respect and love, and also of a kind of warm and warmly accepted obligation to help his mother and the people she cared about who didn't have the material means to live as abundantly as they might. So I think that helping his mother was fundamental to his drive to be successful in business. I also think that he really understood making money and having a secure income for which he was not dependent on others. I think that it was very important for him from an intellectual standpoint because he didn't want to be obliged to go along with the beliefs of an employer with which he fundamentally disagreed. And so putting together his own company enabled him to create that freedom for himself. And freedom is in some ways the central value of his life. And he wanted the intellectual freedom that comes with a material stability in one's life. And he started the O.C. Tanner Company the same year that Virginia Woolf gave the lectures at Cambridge that became A Room of One's Own. And they both had the same thesis. We need material well-being of a certain level so that we can have and claim our intellectual independence and our own creativity. And so I like the idea of Obert and Virginia Woolf reaching that understanding on their own paths, as it were.
Thank you, Mark. That is a remarkable connection. I really appreciate hearing that. I love Virginia Woolf. And it's also worth noting that the O.C. Tanner Company is a famously great place to work. He really, in that sense of support that is his ethos with his own family and with his community, is also something he made central to his company as well. He has very loyal employees who he's taken care of their whole lives, and people who've worked there really enjoyed working there.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that was a matter of the very first importance for Obert. I think one thing that he carried into his adult life from his upbringing in the LDS Church in Farmington in the early decades of the 20th century was the value of community. Obert greatly valued communities, and I know that he wanted to build a community at his business, a community of employees that was respected, appreciated, and rewarded. And he did that. And it's still, as I think all three of us in the room know, it's still very much the ethos of the O.C. Tanner Company to make sure that employees come first and to provide the means they need for well-being at work and a kind of high standard of material well-being in their lives.
So the other important leg of his life was his work as a writer, as an intellectual, as a researcher. Could you give us just a brief overview of his books and his work for the church?
Yes, he really did enjoy writing and was really engaged in both a scholarly and a humanistic way in writing books over the course of his life. As a young scholar, he was a very genuine New Testament scholar, and I've read some of his early work on the New Testament, which is tremendously well-informed and insightful. And it's also true that he did work within the LDS Church as an educator and as a writer in the 1920s. And he so impressed people in the church that he was made an extraordinary offer in 1931. And this was by the church, and a letter from the LDS Church president promised all these things formally to Obert. They said, "We will pay for you to go get a PhD at the University of Chicago, and then we will hold the chair of the Department of Religious Studies at Brigham Young for you until you get back."
Wow. That's a remarkable testament.
It was an extraordinary offer, and Obert loved studying religion. He was a New Testament scholar, and he loved having discussions about religion and philosophies of religion and so on. And he was very attracted to the idea, as one can understand, but he, after a lot of soul searching, he declined it because he didn't feel that his views were orthodox enough, though in many ways he always remained loyal to the well-being of the church. He didn't feel at that point in his life that his views were orthodox enough to really sustain him through this career of working as a religious scholar for the church. But he says in his autobiography that it was a moment of great sadness when he declined, and it was obviously a tremendous moment of decision for him. There was also an earlier one where he was working for William Schubeck, a jeweler here in Salt Lake in the 1920s when he was going to the university. And they had a colorful relationship, but after a couple of years, Schubeck said, "I want you to come and work with me and run the store with me, and I will give you half its profits." This to a young man whose mother scrubbed other people's floors for 15 cents an hour. And in that moment, the decision was between going fully into the jewelry business or continuing his education. He thought about it, and he chose his education.
Wow. I want to turn now to his own family and what he's known for, his philanthropy. And I want to start with something he says at the end of his autobiography. I'm going to read this passage. "As I look back over my life, I see three values at work. I did not invent them. I did not achieve them. They were recurrent challenges, lights to live by and graces to enjoy. They are known by the labels freedom, kindness, and beauty. Freedom is the most familiar and continuous theme of this narrative, his autobiography. It was there from my early days in Farmington, Utah, and it remains a major value today. I try to encourage it for others. I have stressed my belief that a good family is one in which children are encouraged to claim their freedom, and that a good society allows expansiveness, change, and variety. Entrenched powers, whether in authority roles, accepted ideologies, or institutional structures, are common and necessary to every culture. Yet these powers often work against our finding the best solutions to our problems, the best answers to our questions, because they limit freedom to search.
I think I actually read that this morning, Scott, and I think it's tremendously important in understanding Obert. And note the humility with which he speaks about those values of freedom and kindness and beauty. And I think it's interesting that Obert wrote this book the year before he died, and it was published in the year he died in 1993. And this was kind of a backward glance o'er traveled roads, as Walt Whitman would say. And I think it's very interesting that he was always, as a scholar and as an educator, a great advocate of the Platonic trinity of truth and goodness and beauty. And I think it's interesting that right at the end of his life, the trinity becomes freedom, kindness, and beauty. And I think that subtle but important change might reflect what he had learned and how he had been shaped by his life experience. I even hear some of John Stuart Mill's specific vocabulary in that passage that you just read. And I think Obert, and again his mother, is probably I was going to say the fountain, but that gets us towards Obert's philanthropies, but she was the source of his commitment to freedom of thought and freedom of speech and a kind of classic Anglo-American liberal ideal. And I think the passage you just read has immediate bearing on the hostility that exists culturally and governmentally to universities and higher education in our own historical moment right now.
Yes, and I think we're very lucky that we are part of his legacy, and the Humanities Center here at the University of Utah is one of the important institutions he endowed, along with the Tanner Lecture on Human Values, which maybe you could give us a brief overview about, along with support for other educational institutions, as well as fountains, as I said.
Right. Obert loved fountains. He loved the sentence, I think it's in the first chapter of Moby Dick. Meditation and water are wedded forever. And he certainly found a truth of his own experience in Melville's line. And I think he wanted people to have meditative moments. He valued reflection. Later in life, he said, I like fountains because they're non-controversial. Everybody likes fountains. And so he was happy to exercise his philanthropy in that way. There was a moment, going toward your point about the Tanner Lectures on Human Values, when he and Grace, and we really need to talk about Grace. I pass her Alvin Gitten's portrait every day walking to the English department from the alumni parking lot. It's in the alumni house, and one can see it from the walkway outside. And Grace was equally extraordinary in her own life, in her own support for Obert, and her own resilience, frankly, in the face of tragedy. And that's a very big part of Obert's story. And as you have no doubt noted, Obert dedicates his autobiography to his mother and to Grace. So at any rate, in 1975, Obert was down for a dedication of a fountain at what is now Utah Tech University in St. George, and he was there Obert and Grace were there with their great friends, Sterling McMurrin, extraordinarily eminent person in the history of this university and of national education, and Natalie McMurrin, and they had dedicated the fountain and were walking back to their motel. And Sterling said, Obert, I think I have an idea about how you might spend your money better. And the whole idea of a national, indeed international lectureship sponsored by Obert and Grace took flight immediately. Obert said, I think that's a great idea. Obert didn't wait to do things that he thought were of great value. And when the four of them had that conversation in St. George, he came back, contacted David Gardner immediately, who was president of the University of Utah at that time, and who was tremendously helpful and important in the process through which the Tanner Lectures were established. And they kicked off with lectures in 1976, in the 1976-77 academic year. And here we are approaching the 50th anniversary of this remarkable series, which, since I've been involved with it, a number of people have told me, and I can't find a way to disagree with them, that it's the most significant academic lecture series in the world.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And of course, the Tanner Humanities Center. One of the disappointments I had with his autobiography is that he doesn't mention his creation of the center. I think he must have been doing it just as he was writing the book.
It did happen very late in his life. I had the pleasure of knowing Lowell Durham. There was a Humanities Center at the university that had been founded, but not for long, that Lowell Durham was the director of. And the offices were down in Carlson Hall, a building now no longer standing. And I had some meetings with Lowell at the time and just really respected him very much. And I know Obert did too. And I know that Lowell helped Obert with the autobiography and in terms of reading chapters and so on. And I'm not exactly sure how the change was initiated, but Obert and Grace did get involved. And the person who really became involved was, of course, their daughter, Carolyn Tanner Irish. And she was a tremendous advocate for this, and Obert and Grace supported it. And because Obert and Grace were getting older and a bit frail, and indeed Obert passed away shortly after this happened, Carolyn really led the charge. And it's been a wonderful landmark of the Tanner family's philanthropy, and even more specifically, as you started off by saying today, the Tanner Humanities Center is a reflection of how Obert and Carolyn and the whole family have been dedicated to the humanities as an essential part of the human experience, both for the individual and for the collective. And I'm very happy to say that Obert and Grace's grandson and Carolyn's son, Stephen Tanner Irish, Dr. Stephen Tanner Irish, is now teaching philosophy here at the U, in addition to running the company down on State Street. And so I like that very much, because he's doing exactly what Obert did. Between 1945 and 1974, he taught here at the university in the philosophy department for 29 years. And he would teach here in the morning and then go downtown to build up his business in the afternoon. And Sterling McMurrin once said that there were people, including professors at the U, who did not know that Professor Obert Tanner and O.C. Tanner, the jeweler, were, in fact, the same person.
It's hard to believe. It makes me tired just to
It
think
does.
about
It does indeed.
Quoting Eleanor Roosevelt, is that right? About his mother's book. Do you want to tell this story?
Yeah. Obert really felt a great commitment politically to the United Nations after World War II. And I think that his commitment to a kind of international organization which could resolve conflicts before they became matters of open warfare. I think it really was his deepest political commitment. I think it came in part from his experience in Germany, where he went on a Mormon mission in the years after World War I. And he writes about that, and writes about how, in speaking with German people in the early 20s, he was struck by how collectively damaged they were in the spirit, as well as practically and in practical terms and material terms. And it disturbed him very much. And he felt great sympathy for the people who felt alienated from life and religion and spirituality because of the experience of World War I. And then in the aftermath of World War II, particularly with the advent of nuclear weapons, he felt very strongly that there needed to be a kind of rational and good faith effort on the part of all nations to preserve a future for humanity. And during his work, very extended work, but during his work immediately after World War II, he became very good friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, who was also, of course, a great advocate of the UN. And Obert loaned her his personal copy of the first edition of A Mormon Mother, Annie's autobiography, which came out in the year of her death, actually, 1941. And she did read it and returned the book to Obert and said, "I am just emotionally exhausted at having read that book because of its portrayal of and certainly not in any kind of an indulgent way by Annie Clark Tanner, but its portrayal of the hard facts of her personal history. So that was very important. And Obert won or was awarded the UN Medal for Peace in 1978. A great honor, and based on what I know about the heartfelt nature of Obert's commitment to peace, I think richly deserved. And it's a footnote of history that 2 awards were given that year, one to Obert and one to the Bee Gees, who had given a concert, all of the proceeds from which went to UNICEF. That's part of Obert's story. He also, through his philanthropies, was recognized with the National Medal of the Arts in 1988 and went to the White House, the Reagan White House, and was honored with IMP, another great artist and patron of the arts. And it meant a great deal to him to have that experience.
Thank you, Marcus. It's a remarkable legacy, and I'm very happy that we ended with his work on diplomacy, on the UN, as well as recognizing that this is all coming from his mother. I think that's really important. It is a remarkable legacy. We're the beneficiaries of that. Our audiences are the beneficiaries of that. And I really appreciate you taking the time to come talk to us about Obert C. Tanner.
Scott, thank you so much. What an honor for me, and what a pleasure that you've sent me back through some of Obert's speeches from the 1950s and things like that in preparation for today. And my great thanks to Beth James as well. I'm just deeply grateful to be affiliated with the Tanner Humanities Center and with the Tanner Lectures on Human Values, and I just appreciate what both of you are doing to further the Tanner legacy.
You've been listening to the Virtual Jewel Box podcast of the Tanner Humanities Center. Our theme music is Jelly Roll Morton's Perfect Rag. Thanks for joining us.